Okay, hello everybody. Hello to whoever is here watching right now. Hello to anybody who's catching the replay of this. Thank you for taking the time to watch this and be here with me. This is my first time running one of these sessions, so I'm really excited. And here we go. I'm going to get into it. So, hello, welcome. My name is Emily. I am the tumbling coordinator here at Premier Academy Red Deer. So I joined Premier. Here's my little backstory. I joined Premier in 2010 as an athlete, and then I started coaching when I was about 17 years old. Um, when I was a kid in high school, I like ran my little high school team, and then I learned that I wanted to coach. I moved to BC, and I ended up coaching at Cheer Sport Sharks Vancouver out there, U12 level 1, U16 level 1, and then a lot of tumbling. I had a really good experience out there, so I decided that I wanted to go full time with coaching. So I ended up reaching out to Rihanna and I asked if we had any positions here. And sure enough, I was super, super lucky and I was able to coach a lot last season. So last season was my first year back at Premier. And I was here part-time doing like a bunch of level 1 stuff and then some tumbling classes as well. This season is actually my first season as the tumbling coordinator here, as well as coaching. I coach A+, I coach sophomores and J League, and I do a ton of semis. So, and I'm completely full-time this year. So this is my full-time thing that I'm doing. This is my career, and I'm really, really excited and passionate to talk about tumbling with you guys today. Yeah, and then on my screen here, that's me, that's a picture of me. And then the picture on the left side of the screen is me as an athlete with Premier. And then the picture on the right is me coaching my team. And it's a really cool thing here that, that you can kind of grow up through the program and then become a coach one day. So it's really, really awesome. Okay, so like I say, first year tumbling coordinator. I, as an athlete, always struggled with tumbling. It never came easy to me. So once I became a coach, I was very focused on fully understanding the skills I needed to teach. I realized very quickly that providing athletes with the technical knowledge led to stronger skills and better outcomes long term. So I've been coaching for a relatively short amount of time, but like in comparison to some other people, but I've basically found that like giving the athletes all the knowledge possible about the skills and like really teaching them really thoroughly has led to some pretty good outcomes pretty quickly. So over time, these things definitely lead to the ability to perform higher level skills. Within my scope of coaching and teaching, I knew that I wanted to give athletes all the tools necessary to hopefully progress to really high levels without plateauing. That's essentially what happened to me. I got to kind of the intermediate point in tumbling and then found that I was just stuck. Like I couldn't progress anymore and I couldn't figure out why. Now as a coach, looking back on it, I'm like, I wish that I could go back and kind of help myself through that, because realistically what it kind of comes down to is not following the progression, which is essentially what we're going to talk about today. Yeah, so my first season as tumbling director here, it's been my goal to instill these ideas about progression throughout the program as a whole so that hopefully we can see that growth across the entire program, recreationally and competitively. My goal is to develop high-level athletes by empowering them to get to that level from day one of training. So from the first forward roll to your first double full, like we're taking every single step and we're not training for a certain skill, but we're training to be a very high-level athlete in the end. So the stuff that we're going to talk about today, these are not exclusively my own ideas. A lot of the theoretical knowledge of this comes from gymnastics. I've also had some incredible opportunities to work one-on-one with head tumbling coaches and directors at some really notable programs. I've been really, really lucky to have these experiences so early in my career. So I've used a lot. I credit so much of my knowledge to some of those coaches that I was able to work with. Yeah, and even at Premier in general, we're really lucky that our coaches get to attend like conferences and we get to learn from the best in the industry. Just this last summer, I was able to go up to the States and work with some of these coaches, and I learned so much that weekend, and it's been like a daily thing for me to be applying that knowledge that I got to to the everyday goings of the gym. Like I'm here every single day, so I'm trying to use as much of that to make us as good as we can be, essentially, and as good as my athletes can be. So all right, now that's kind of me, my background, my why. We're going to get into realistically what we came to talk about here, which is progression. The definition of progression is essentially the process of developing or moving gradually towards a more advanced state. That's essentially exactly what we do when we learn tumbling, whether it's in classes or semis. I like the analogy of it being a ladder. So the important point being that you can't skip steps. There's one path to the top of the ladder, you know, the top of the ladder being a really, really high level. Every athlete is going to climb the same path on the ladder. The speed that they reach the top of the ladder is going to be the variable. So every athlete moves at their own pace, but it's important to note that taking the time and doing it properly is the key to long-term success in the end, right? So, you know, we start at the bottom with our very first tumbling class we ever do. If we take our time through this progression and we do it properly from day one, we're going to be able to reach this level one day, right? Whereas training to just get a certain skill isn't necessarily going to have the same outcome in the end. This idea is kind of, it's a partnership between the coach and the athlete. The coach has to have the knowledge to get the athlete there, and the athlete has to have the work ethic and the patience to be able to trust the coach to get there. So it's a two-way relationship there. In like Olympic level gymnastics, or even world championship level cheerleading, if you're a parent of a cheerleader, programs, you see athletes doing the same skills in their routines, or, you know, gymnastics, you see them doing their floor routines. We're all doing the same skills, right? But they have this level where everything looks extremely similar no matter what athlete's doing it. So I could look at two athletes doing a back handspring and they look nearly identical. This is all to do with the process of acquiring these skills and the conditioning along the way to get a consistent result. They all climbed the same ladder. So if they all followed the same process, the skill looks pretty much the same because the skill is done with really good technique, right? They climbed the same ladder. It might have taken the one kid a year. It might have taken the other kid 2 weeks, but regardless, they went through the same progression. In our sport, cheerleading, we are doing a lot of the same skills as that sport, but as a whole, we don't have the same level of consistency. You know, you can see it when you're watching a routine. You know, there might be 20 kids on the floor doing that back handspring, and every single kid is doing it slightly differently, right? Yeah, so we don't have that level of consistency or mastery that you would see in a really high level gymnast. Or we see a lot less of it in general. You know, there's definitely programs out there that are achieving that, but it's really just because our sport is so new that we aren't necessarily at that same level yet, but every single day the sport grows and we're getting closer to that point and the standard keeps going up. And realistically, it has a lot to do with the culture of our sport and the pressure to level kids up, unfortunately. The rush to progress is what holds our athletes back, right? I want to make this level team, and then they're throwing these skills. So it's a tough one, whereas gymnastics is more of an individual sport. They can progress at their own pace. So you can kind of connect kind of where I'm going with that. Maybe you know a gymnast, but usually the big thing that's talked about is how many hours a week they train, how hard they condition, etc. I was just talking to Miss Kelly the other day, another coach here at Premier. She was a gymnast before she did cheer, and she told me she was training like 4.5 hours a night. We're lucky if we get one of our cheer athletes for 4.5 hours a week, let alone 4 hours a night, you know? So, and that's if you put your athlete in a semi, right? So that should put into perspective how much time these athletes are actually putting into acquiring these skills with that level of technique. It is super important to take your time to develop strong foundational skills. We want to hold our athletes to a higher standard for their long-term growth. The time spent working on the basic skills should be the longest skill acquiring periods, ideally, right? So just because that's where they're learning all of their habits and their technique, you want to spend the most time here. If you spend a lot of time here and they have really good habits, then you'll find that the rest of the progression takes less time because each skill leads into the next. For example, if you have a kid that does a handstand with their head out like this, she's going to do the same thing in her back handspring. She's going to do the same thing when she goes for her tuck. So it's creating those habits from day one. I've got a lot of kids that I'm working like flipping skills with, so tucks and layouts. And it's funny because I spend most of the time going backwards and fixing their foundational skills. So the actual time that we get to spend working on those higher level skills becomes a lot less. A lot of the time, the problem isn't with the flipping skill, the tuck, the layout. It's actually a problem with the round off or the back handspring that leads into the skill. You can largely avoid this by taking the proper care earlier on at the bottom of that ladder. Bottom line is that 30 minutes of tumbling a week isn't always enough to climb that ladder really quickly. For the athletes that do climb it relatively quickly, it's usually due to a strong foundational base, or the athlete already has the mechanical ability to perform the skills. And I'll get into kind of what mechanical ability is later here. But that's essentially the idea. Moving right along here. So here's a brief overview of our tumbling program here at Premier Academy. Progression is essentially built into the system. An athlete starts in beginner and moves through the classes. Within each of these classes, we have skills that the athletes need to acquire in order to level up. These all flow really seamlessly into each other. So in beginner basics, let's use a round off as an example. In beginner basics, the athlete's going to learn how to do a long jump with their arms lining up by their ears. In advanced basics, the athlete's going to learn how to do a long jump, step into a lunge, and then they're going to learn a long jump into a lunge, which is essentially a power hurdle. And then in walkovers, they're going to learn their round off from a passe position. And then they're going to learn their round off from the power hurdle. So we're thinking like step by step, right? You don't want to just throw the power hurdle round off at the kid in beginner basics, right? That skill is made up of several other skills that they're going to learn through the progression of our classes. If your athlete's in semis, it's kind of the same idea. We're going to be breaking down those skills in the same way. They're going to follow the same progression. It's just not broken up into the classes. And realistically, the athletes that have a really strong foundation and spent a lot of time over here, they're going to be able to learn higher level skills quicker than you might expect because they took the right steps and they took their time, right? It doesn't need to take years to learn higher level skills. You know, if you have a kid that's stuck on a tuck for like 2 years, it's not the tuck. It's the fact that probably like 9 times out of 10, we didn't spend enough time in these basic skills and they're lacking that foundational knowledge to be able to do those higher level skills. The rushing of those skills is going to be the major detriment that you're going to see like with your athlete. You're going to eventually get to a big plateau because of the lack of technique. It's really tough to fake some of those high level skills. Like if there's a fundamental that's missing, you're going to see that gap at some point. Usually that comes about at layouts, or when we get into harder standing tumbling skills. Yeah, I mean, and using myself as an example, like I said, I always struggled with tumbling, and I got to that point of starting to learn tucks, and like I didn't have the technique to be able to execute the things I needed to be able to execute for that skill. So I essentially got stuck there, and now we have the non-tumbling division, and that's I honestly believe that division exists because for people like me that didn't go through the right progression. You don't want to end your career in cheerleading because you're not strong at tumbling, right? But bottom line is, if we're able to, now that we know more, we can support the kids through this journey and make sure that they get to the point where they get that double full and they're on that world's team. And that's ultimately what we want, right? We want to go from beginner basics all the way up to twists and tricks. We want to fill those classes. We want to have lots of kids that can do those skills, right? So here is an example of a progression, using a front handspring as an example. These are all of the skills that make up a front handspring, right? And this is even maybe less detailed than it could be, but you can see we have to take all these steps. They're going to learn the half handstand, then the handstand, then they're going to do a handstand and fall to their back, then they're going to handstand fall to bridge, then they're going to do a front limber, then they're going to do a front walkover, then they're going to do a power hurdle to handstand, block to their back, then they're going to do a front walkover with a block, then they're going to do a front handspring. So again, and there's things in there too that you could put in between each of these skills. It's the more detailed you get with that learning, the better that the outcome is going to be in the end. Each skill is the makeup of all the skills you learned before it. So if I just went handstand, front walkover, front handspring, I missed all these steps. I'm lacking the foundational technique that I need to do that skill. Can I still do the skill and land on my feet? Yeah, but the outcomes of like when we start getting into more front tumbling, like a punch front, a front layout, you could do front fulls. Like there's tons of stuff that this learning will support in the end, right? So you don't want to train for a front handspring. You want to train for whatever the level 6 version of that skill is. Yeah, I think that's, yeah. And then if you do this properly, then when you pass the front handspring, the next skills are going to come quicker because we have the foundational technique. Okay, moving along here. All right, so now I'm gonna talk about my favorite thing ever, and I'm gonna try to not get too long-winded with it, because anybody that knows me knows that I could talk about this stuff for hours and be super boring. So we're gonna talk about the importance of tumbling drills and why we do them versus spotting an athlete over and over again until basically throwing it till they can do it, right? And again, I always like to relate things to my own experience. You know, I started at Premier Academy in 2010. Cheerleading was a very new sport, as I was saying before. And like at that time, like anybody that had any experience in it could really coach it, right? So we were all learning. So as the athletes were learning, the coaches were learning. This is like, you know, however long ago, 2010, right? I would come in here into the gym on a Sunday, and I have an hour-long one-on-one session with me and a coach. And like I was like, I want to learn a back handspring because I want to make level 2, right? So we'd get our little crash mat out. I'd get up on the crash mat, and for an hour straight, like I would just throw back handsprings over and over again. And she's this close to me, she's spotting me, so she's not seeing what I'm doing necessarily. Throwing it, and she's essentially taking away spot like as we do it, so that eventually I'm doing it unassisted. But the problem with that is that when you rep something, when you put in like hundreds of reps into a skill, you're developing habits, right? So that's kind of how we learned things back in the day. It was just like, we're going to just do it till we can do it by ourselves. And I was like, because I learned it that way, I was never able to execute a back handspring that felt easy. And I think that for me, I always thought tumbling's so hard, like, and I was good at the rest of the sport. I could jump, I could stunt, but there was always this fear and anxiety around tumbling for me, because I was like, why isn't this clicking? Like, why is it easy for this person? Why does theirs look like that? Why does mine look like this? Like, am I not working hard enough? When I was in the gym, like throwing 100 handsprings in an hour, right? And I'm thinking I'm not working hard enough, but in reality, I lacked the knowledge of how to do that skill, right? So yeah, and that's just how we learned back then. And kids that learned that way, that got to a high level, or basically they had the mechanical ability to do the skills. You know, they had the natural ability to do it. There's always going to be kids like that, like 100%. There's always going to be kids that can kind of go through it and still have a really good result. But if you're like me, or if you're athletes like me, that's not going to be the case. So it's very important that we support them properly. So basically, as the sport has grown, you know, now this is like years later, right? Years down the line, we've become a lot more aware of how to teach tumbling properly. And realistically, the standards that we need to hold our athletes to get higher and higher every season as we grow as a sport and also as a program. You know, the more demanding the sport becomes, the more technical we need to get to make sure that your athlete makes it to Worlds one day. Like when I was a kid, the stuff that we were doing was so basic compared to the demands that the sport has now to do well competitively. Like it's night and day. The sport grows and it gets harder and harder every single year. So it's only going to go up from here, and the technique that your athlete's going to need to excel in this sport is going to get higher every year. And we want to support them through that. So instead of throwing it over and over again method, we now teach skills through drills. Setting up drills with equipment is what gives athletes the technical knowledge and ability to progress, to follow progression, follow the ladder, right? Drills essentially give the athlete parameters to complete the skill within. These parameters develop technique. So when I set up a bunch of mats on the floor, there's a lot of different things that we're taking into consideration. You know, you're thinking about their angles, you're thinking about their body shape, you're thinking about the execution of the skill. There's so many concepts we can teach through drills: length, angles, body shapes, proper head placement, where are your eyes looking, etc. Right? This is typically done, like I said, by putting together different pieces of equipment in ways to teach different concepts. My like big rule is that skills should always be learned on equipment. And anytime we take a skill to a sprung floor, that is for mastery, absolute mastery. The floor is like final, right? So if your athlete's learning a skill, ideally we see them learning, you see this like it could be simple, it could be like two pieces of equipment, it could be a big setup. It doesn't matter. It's just that we're doing it properly and we're teaching the concepts, right? So it doesn't have to be elaborate all the time, but generally what we want to be seeing is that they're learning it on equipment, right? And then they're not just throwing it, like I said. Yeah, and then sprung floor or even an air track, like we're not taking that skill to that surface until they've learned it on the equipment and until it's executed fairly solidly on an easier surface first. We move it from equipment, then maybe we go on trampoline, then maybe we take it to like an air track sort of thing, and then we take it to the floor. Like there's a process with that. But the moment that the kid throws the skill on the floor, that is when they have learned it and they have mastered it. Ideally, personally, I don't want a kid repping a skill with poor technique because, like I said, how I learned, this is how habits are formed, right? I want to give them parameters to ensure that the athlete is forming really good habits so that every time they do that skill, they have that technique and they're building good habits for that skill, but also for all the skills that follow it, like we talked about before. Just a little personal plug here, but you can check out my Instagram at Tumbling Coach Emily, and you'll see examples of what I'm talking about. I post a ton of technical breakdowns on there and a bunch of different drills that I'm doing with my athletes, and that'll give you an idea of kind of what I'm talking about. Like I said, personally, I'm not going to have an athlete do a skill on the floor with or without spot until I'm 100% confident that they have a really good understanding of that skill and they can execute it with good technique within reason. We need to across the sport, and like especially like even in our program across the sport, whatever, I really want to dismantle the belief of, oh, it looks a little crazy right now, but at least she's throwing it, it's going to get better with time. I think the thought is that it's going to get better the more that they repeat it and the more repetition. But in the reality, doing something the same way over and over again is how we create habits, and breaking a bad habit is a lot easier said than done. Breaking the habit is way harder than learning it properly in the first place, right? And for real, there's no reason why an athlete's first attempt at a skill shouldn't be technically pretty good within reason. The way that we're teaching our tumbling skills is through drills and repetition and through like reinforcing the body shape so that they're like essentially building muscle memory in these shapes, right? I have a wicked athlete that I teach in a semi, and she came to me with a round of handspring tuck, wanted to learn a layout. The first thing I did was reteach her tuck to make sure she was rotating in a way that didn't throw her head back. We're rotating by driving the hips, using the glutes. I had to reteach her head placement. We kind of went backwards so that we could go forwards. And because we did that, then there was a lot of drills like doing a layout to a candlestick position on top of some elevated mats. Like there was a whole progression that we followed, and like for probably 2-3 months, just repetition, but good repetition, right? Not just throwing the skill, but setting the parameters for her. And then eventually she had done it so much that she had built the confidence. I was like, are you ready to try it on the floor by yourself? I didn't have to spot her one time, right? I put a mat down for her to land on. And she threw that skill with like pretty dang good technique for the first time. Within probably 4, she was doing it with technique where I was like, yep, you have that skill now. Like that's well executed. It wasn't like a chuck it and pray, it was like, it was well executed and I didn't have to spot her. She had the confidence, which I think is like amazing. And that's kind of the way that I want to be teaching my skills. I want to empower my athletes to feel like they're capable to do the skill and they're not relying on me to, levitate them in the air. And then I guess the next thing kind of that I need to talk about with this is anytime an athlete wants to put in extra work, whether it's at home or at the gym, that is always a good thing, right? But if there's one thing that I could kind of get across to like parents for their athletes is, your kid has a trampoline at home or an air track or something like that, that's awesome. Like I love that they want to put in that work outside of practice or outside of their tumbling. But we do have to be mindful that we are slightly managing what it is that they're attempting to do on these surfaces, not only for their safety, but also, like I said, it goes back to the thing of if they rep a skill a whole bunch with a certain level of technique, that is how they will throw that skill forever, unless they trust a coach a lot to go back and relearn it. And it's not a fun thing for an athlete to have to do. So my like recommendation is like working on skills at home that they already have a good technical knowledge of, whether it's like from a coach in their tumbling class or their semi, or it's a skill that they already have by themselves with pretty good technique, you know, or if it's a skill that they're working on, that we're just making sure we reinforce the technique that they're learning from their tumbling coach. And you can kind of make this easier by having communication with their tumbling coach, like, you know, what are they working on? Or if they are working on a skill at home, what can I do to make sure that they're repping this with good techniques? I don't want them to form bad habits. And, you know, lots of times we can give you like an at-home kind of plan for them. And we can give you some of that knowledge to make sure that they're learning in like the most, like in the safest way possible and the best way possible for their growth. Yeah, and I think that's great. If they want to work at home, let's just make sure that they're putting their time into, they're using their time wisely, right? And they're not just creating problems for themselves. Okay, moving right along into here. I said I was going to come back to this. Distinguishing between technical and mechanical. So, in tumbling, you can either have like, if I have a kid that comes to me and I'm looking at their tumbling, there's two different kind of problems that we can have in tumbling. One is a technical issue, one is a mechanical issue. A technical issue is like, let's say in a round of back handspring, you know, you need to, your feet are underneath you or behind you when you're going into your handspring, so your handspring's too high. That's a technique problem. And I can fix that through drills by enforcing the shape of their feet being in front of them, their tail being tucked under, etc. A mechanical issue is the body's ability or inability to complete certain movements. You could do every single drill in the world, but it won't fix a mechanical inability. So again, going back to a back handspring, it's like shoulder flexibility and stability, right? If their arms are, so let's go at it two ways. So let's talk about a back handspring. A technical issue, maybe the approach into the skill is wrong. This can be worked on with drills. A mechanical issue is going to be, are their shoulders flexible enough? Are their shoulders stable enough? You know, because maybe if they're bending their arms in their back handspring, maybe it's not a different part of the skill. Maybe it's literally because they can't open up their shoulders enough to hit like a straight handstand shape, right? So maybe they're not flexible enough. Maybe they're not strong enough, and that's why they can't hit that shape, right? And I could have them do the best drills ever, but if they don't have that flexibility and that stability in their shoulders, they're not going to be able to fix that problem. Mechanical, so technical drills are fixed, technical skills are fixed with drills. Mechanical issues are fixed with conditioning. Yeah, it's really just conditioning, gaining more flexibility, gaining more strength, and for whatever particular part of the body we're talking about. In this case, I'm talking about shoulders, and that could be a variety of things, like any sort of shoulder strengthening exercises, right? Yeah, you could do a million drills, but if the body can't do blank, a drill's not going to fix it. And again, I said I'd come back to this. Mechanical inability may be why an athlete isn't climbing the ladder as quickly as they'd like to. So you really got to like look at it and think like, is this a technical issue that the athlete needs to work through drills, or is there like an actual physical inability to be able to do this skill right now? And better body mechanics are developed over time as well. So, you know, you can start with kind of low, you can start a little weaker on this side and you're going to build it up naturally over time. But realistically, like conditioning is going to be the best way to be able to get to that point quicker, instead of like trying to just, you know, trying to just keep going with the drills and tumbling. Like it's going to develop much slower than if you condition that body part. In fact, you can make changes pretty quickly. Going back to like shoulder flexibility, I could spend 5 minutes out of my half an hour semi and I'm going to see that growth each week. Or if I say, you know, this is your homework, you're going to do this thing at home, and they spend like 5 minutes every day doing that, you will see that growth quickly. So it's definitely worth kind of taking a look at that and seeing if your tumbling coach has any recommendations for you. Hold on. just to put it into more perspective here, gymnasts condition their bodies for hours and hours a week to prime themselves to be able to perform these skills. Like I said before, Miss Kelly practiced 4.5 hours every single day. And then compared to the average cheerleader has around 4 hours, 7 hours at the absolute most. I mean, everybody's different. I mean, maybe your athlete's doing 10 hours a week, whatever. But regardless, this is not enough time to develop proper body mechanics to get to a really high level. So if we are just doing, like our practices, our semi, like a lot of the time, depending on where your athlete's at in their like development, they will just naturally get stuck at an intermediate level simply because they don't have the physical capability to do what the body demands us to do to be able to do these really high level skills. Yeah, if your physical capability is lower, then your odds of sustaining an injury are also a lot higher. So to relate this back to the ladder idea and the progression, if we get an athlete on day one learning a forwards roll, we want to be teaching those body mechanics along the way so that we have really good outcomes. Like, are we training an athlete to be a level 3 athlete, or are we training them to have a double full one day, right? And it looks a lot different depending on what that goal is. We don't want to train to do a skill. We want to train to become a high level athlete. So what can we do? If we can only get our athlete in here 4 hours a week for their practice, and then we're doing a tumbling class or a semi, that's going to add on another half an hour to 45 minutes. What can we do other than that, right? If we don't have either, sometimes it comes down to financial means, like if we can't afford another additional 30 minutes or, whatever it is, just increasing overall hours training, whether it's in the gym or out of the gym, is going to get you a better outcome. If your athlete wants to reach that high level one day, they need to be putting in more hours. That's like point number one. It's going to help them with their technique. It's going to help them with their body mechanics. You're going to see them climb the ladder faster the more time they're putting in, of course. And this could be in or out of the gym. But like I said, with the at-home training, just be mindful of what they're spending their time doing. The next thing, just being okay with conditioning being a part of your athlete's weekly tumbling. I think that with our semis and our classes being half an hour or 45 minutes, it's like we want to get as much time out of these kids tumbling as possible. We want to get as much reps in as possible. But again, in reality, if we're repping these skills and they don't have those body mechanics developed yet, we're still going to progress slower. So if we're okay with spending that time doing some of that gymnastics kind of training, again, it's going to lead to better outcomes. And this could look like, developing more explosiveness, like doing plyometrics, training the core, holding static body positions. This is a big thing with gymnasts. They will literally hold like a hollow body position for, 2-3 minutes. And the brain is memorizing what that shape feels like. That's the shape that they're going to hit in their handstand. They're going to hit it in their back handspring. They're going to hit it in their layout. They're going to hit it in their full. So the more time we spend in these shapes, the better chance we have of hitting those shapes in our skills, right? So you might see your athlete like laying on the floor, holding a position, and it's like, come on, like let's get them tumbling, like let's get this kid doing some cool stuff, right? But in reality, that kind of work is equally as important as repping those skills. So just kind of having that knowledge of like why it is we're doing that, I think is helpful. Okay, and then the next thing, emphasis on proper nutrition and hydration for your athlete, making sure your athlete's prepared to come into their whether it's a cheerleading practice or a tumbling class or a tumbling semi, that they ate well-rounded meals throughout the day, that you're like educated on the kind of nutrition, and somebody that's like doing this level of sport, like they need to be eating properly. They have to come prepared to practice with a water bottle. They need to be drinking water throughout the day. Dehydration is something that I think some people don't know leads to injury a lot of the times. Like you want the muscles to like be nice and well lubricated. We don't want to be risking anything with that. So hydration is super, super important. Yeah, so I'm not gonna, I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm not gonna kind of go into that, but definitely there's lots of resources online. I follow somebody on Instagram. It's like if you look up gymnast nutrition, and like they just go into it of like what you need to kind of do to be able to have like an optimal session when you're tumbling and doing this high level of sport. Like it's the demands that your athlete is putting their body through for this sport, it's like a lot more than you might think. So preparing them to do that stuff, eating like a granola bar before practice is not sufficient, and you'd be surprised how much we see that. Or, cup of noodles, like they won't have as good of an outcome if they aren't prioritizing their health in that way. So just kind of educating as parents and as the athletes as well. If you have an older athlete, I would just super kind of stress that to them, how important that is, and that habit is going to carry them through for the rest of their life as well. Definitely not something I prioritized when I was an athlete again. So no, I'm just trying to get these kids to learn from my mistakes. Okay, another thing you can do is ask your coaches for an at-home conditioning plan. Ideally, that focuses on strength, mobility, and flexibility. And yeah, like you can ask for that specifically. And that's something that they can follow at home. So like I said, when they do their at-home training, that they're using their time really wisely. Okay, and then the last thing on here is one of the bigger things, and I keep saying the biggest thing, but this is another thing that I would super stress for parents is prioritize your athlete being on a team where they're performing tumbling skills that they have mastered versus pushing them for a higher level where they're going to be repping skills and developing poor habits. So again, relating this all back to my beginning story of throwing a skill over and over again with poor technique is going to lead to issues for them in their long-term tumbling growth. So say, your athlete's working on tucks, they can do it unassisted. It's not consistent. And they're just struggling a little bit in that area. Like I would super recommend that they actually are on a level 2 team, even though they have those skills. It's just, do we want to compete a skill that we have mastered or that we're working on, right? And the amount of reps that they're doing in these practices, it could be a detriment to some of these skills. So making sure that it's skills that they have like a really good technical understanding of like is super important. And this goes back to the idea of the pressure on kids to level up. It's such a detriment to their long-term growth. So taking a step back and being on that level 2 team might actually support their growth to that world's team one day more than the level 3 or the level 4 would. So just something to consider. Yeah, just again, it's one of those things. I don't think there's many sports where we're pushing kids to be performing skills that they haven't mastered yet, right? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it's something that I think we need to kind of, it is starting to change within the sport. But I think the more that we're open to it and like embracing that change, the better it's going to be for our kids in the end, right? Okay, last little slide here. If you have any questions or want any advice or feedback on any skills, please do not hesitate to message me you can either message me on Band, you can send me an email, which is just emily@premieracademy.ca. Like I said, find my Instagram, tumbling coach @tumblingcoachemily. And I'd be more than happy to provide you with some of those training plans. Reach out for training plans for your athlete to do at home. Even if I don't coach your athlete, like I'm more than happy to do that because I'm really passionate about this. Reach out if your athlete is doing a skill and it feels really hard for them and they don't know why, you don't know if it's technical or mechanical, reach out to me. I'm more than happy to answer questions on that, provide suggestions or feedback. So anytime, just shoot me a message on any of those platforms, and I'd be more than happy to help you or your athlete out. So yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this, whether you sat in on this today or you're catching the replay of it. Thank you for taking the time. Anytime that we can kind of all as a whole be like more educated in this sport, I think it's going to lead to better outcomes for the sport and better outcomes for your athletes. So really glad to do it, and thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions last minute here, feel free to pop them in the chat. I'm going to hang around for the next like 2 minutes here, so if there's anything, don't hesitate to pop it down in the chat here. And thank you so much. Thank you for listening.